Things are not always as they appear. Isn't that one of the first and most important lessons we ever learn as humans? Just when we finally think we get something, we understand it, the light changes, the shadows shift, and what we thought we knew is now suddenly once again strange and different. Same is true for people. In fact, people are almost never as they first appear, and that makes dating very interesting. A therapist I used to know used to say, in regard to dating, that the stranger you just met will become far stranger before she becomes more familiar. In other words, when we first meet someone, we're all on our best behavior. We try to hide our flaws. We are perfectly polite. We never eat too much. It appears that we never have to go to the bathroom. But as we get to know one another, and we settle in and become more comfortable, we slowly reveal our real selves to the other person, and that is very often the deal breaker. But sometimes it's the kind of truth that actually sets us free. This is Transgender Awareness Week in the United States and Transgender Awareness Sunday at Broadway Church, the first one we've ever observed, so good for us. It's a time we've purposely set aside to learn more about our sisters and brothers and others who are very often more than they first appear to be. Transgender folks challenge us to take a second and third look at ourselves, not so much at them, but at ourselves, at our own conceptions of gender and the rigid divisions that we assume are normal. Transgender awareness challenges us to purposefully examine the privileges we cisgender people enjoy and take for granted. This is a justice issue, pure and simple. And if we believe, as we say we do, we progressive Christians, that the gospel of Jesus Christ is about justice and peace, then we ought to look at this issue more than just once a year, because things are not as they always appear to be. And as if to prove the point that things are not always as they appear, we have a parable today that appears to be quite distasteful. You will remember that a parable, especially the parables of Jesus, are purposefully vague tales based in common human experience, but meant to provoke much deeper thought. They are not easily interpreted because they are not meant to be easily interpreted. One scholar said that the parables of Jesus are like taking a ball and throwing it high and straight into the air and then standing there, waiting for it to come back to your hands. And just about the time you expect to catch it, the ball veers off to the left or to the right. The parable of the talents is a classic stewardship text, we have been told. It contains the familiar words, "Well done, good and faithful servant." And the common way for it to be interpreted is like this. We have all been given talents or gifts by God, and it is our job not to hide them, not to bury them, not to keep them for ourselves, but to invest them in the world very wisely so that they get a good return. In that interpretation, God is the landowner and we are the slaves. In this story, 2 of the 3 slaves did as they were told, right? They invested the money, they made a great deal more money. But one of the slaves buried his talent. He did not do as the master demanded. And when that master landowner returned and learned that his money had not made any more money, he was furious, to say the least. His third slave was remanded to that awful place called the outer darkness, where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. The moral of the story, then, is to use and increase what you have been given by God. How many of you have ever heard this text preached like that? Yes? But that classic interpretation creates certain significant theological problems. And in order to understand what those problems are, we have to put ourselves in the place of that first audience. How did they hear Jesus tell this story? Well, first of all, we need to understand what the terms used are. We need to get our terms straight. A talent in this story is not a talent like knowing how to paint or sing or write poetry, although our English word talent probably came from this parable. Instead, a talent is the English translation for a Greek word, talanta. And a talanta was actually the largest denomination of currency in the world at that time. It was worth about 6,000 denarii. Well, how much is that? Maybe you want to know. Well, one denarius was the equivalent of a day's wage for a laborer. So do the math. The slave who got 5 talents received 30,000 days of wages. And the one who got 3 talents received 18,000 days of wages. And even the slave who only received 1 talanta received the equivalent of 6,000 days of work, or about 19 years worth of wages. It was a tremendous amount of money. More money than folks in that first audience could even conceive. And because it was so far outside their own experience of life, because they had probably never even seen a talanta before, then they probably would not have assumed that this story was about them. Too far outside their experience. And if this is not a story about them, then maybe it's also not a story about God. There are some clues here to make us think that it's not. First of all, in this story, the rich landowner demands that the law of God be broken. And here is what I mean by that. Upon his return, the landowner is angry with the servant who had 1 talent because the servant buried the money. Why didn't you at least take it to the bank where it could have drawn some interest, he demanded. But that's not something God would say, because charging interest is actually condemned in the First and the New Testaments. Exodus 22:25 reads, "If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, you shall not deal with them as with a creditor. You shall not exact interest from them." That's probably because the poor are the ones least able to pay any interest. The other reason this story cannot be about God is that if it is, then God is a lot less like a loving parent and more like Bernie Madoff. Listen to Jesus' own conclusion to this tale. These horrible, hard-to-understand words. "For to all of those who have, more will be given, and they will have an abundance. But from those who have nothing, Even what they have will be taken away. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. It is the parable of the venture capitalist. Except that things are not always as they appear. There are some New Testament scholars, a good number of them, who argue that this is not a kingdom parable at all. It does not begin with the words, "The kingdom of heaven is like this." It begins with the words, "It is like this," and probably references the story before, which is about the end of the world and what the world will be like at the end. This doesn't describe the reign of God or the character of God. Instead, these scholars say, this is a wisdom parable. And a wisdom parable's point is to warn us about the way of the world so that we will make different choices, godly choices, that will help to usher in the reign of God. And that makes this a very different kind of story. Things are not always as they appear. And so it is with the unlikely hero of this tale. The hero is the one who buried his treasure. If the landowner is just a landowner, then most folks in that first audience understood him to be an enemy of the people. Now that may sound like a stereotype to us capitalist Americans, but that is exactly how first century common folks thought about the rich, and here is why. They understood that the land had been given to everybody by God. It was the land of promise. God was the owner and they were the stewards. And thus the accumulation of land by certain people was seen as a rejection of the covenant. And then to charge those poor, landless peasants interest was just to kick them while they were down. But the third servant saw this situation for what it was, unjust. And having the courage of his convictions, he refused to participate in it. He refused to abuse his own people. To bury the money, then, was not just playing it safe, it was an act of nonviolent resistance. But more than that, this brave servant risked his own comfort and safety to blow the whistle on the wickedness that was happening. He said to the landowner, in front of all these other people, "I knew that you were a harsh man, reaping where you did not sow and gathering where you did not scatter seed, and I won't be any part of it." Of course, there is a price to pay for such moral courage. There always has been. For this man, he was sent away from the glittering world of the rich and powerful into the outer darkness of the cycle of poverty. You think so much of those poor people, you go be with them. That cycle is so bleak that it causes folks to weep and grind their teeth with worry about how they will pay the rent and feed their kids in a system that is stacked against them. So this servant lost everything, except his soul. He kept that. Things are not always as they appear. And so it is with this subversive tale. As much as I wish the moral of this story was for you all and for me to be more generous with our pledging to the church, it It's actually a much harder sell. Because this is a story about being generous with your courage and your convictions. To stand against the tide of the dominant culture. To stand up for those who are oppressed. Even when there is hell to